Baldurs Gate 3. After thoroughly examining this game for a bit, I've come to the conclusion that it's quite good. And it also features one of my favorite D&D enemies, the Mimic. The Mimic is a gentle and docile creature that only wants to be treasured, and therefore disguises itself as a treasure, and they might come off as intimidating when all they really want is a shoulder to lean on. But I'm here to help. Oh. Well, that's awkward. Quickly, let's make a replacement before anyone notices that it's missing. I bet we can use this foam core board as the main structure. Hey, here's a good tip. A round tip is a bad tip, because now we have to get rid of the tips of 1,000,000 coffee stirring sticks. At what point does a board become a stick, you might ask yourself, but that's not the point of this video. Let's just put down a bit of painter's tape, sticky side up. That way we can arrange these boards into our own custom herringbone pattern. I'm gonna be making 2 chests, one regular looking one and one mimic one. And I really wanted to use actual wood for the outer surfaces because to me it feels like wood does wood better than not wood.
Nice.
Ultimately though, this was a little bit unnecessary for the actual mimic body because it ended up getting covered up in clay and other gunk. But we know it's there. We both know it. We can have this knowledge. We're gonna use these herringbone sheets and these foam core board bits to make a chest, so let's glue them onto the outside, and that should provide enough structural integrity to keep the box box-shaped. One of the harder aspects to making things wonky, as seen in the Weasley house craft video that I also made, is to keep things structurally square, while also being able to bend things out of shape. And this is something that I should have thought of before, because now I have to break this apart again to then score up the inside of the foam core board. The Mimic sort of splays out at the top towards the actual Mimic part, so I had this idea of building the rest of the chest out of clay so that I could easily manipulate it and make it unfold like a flower revealing a friendly face. But because I cleverly used foam core board, I can't really shove this whole thing in the oven with Super Sculpey, so I'm gonna have to use air dry clay. This is a stone-based clay that dries really heavy and really hard, and it's pretty good. But it's also pretty bad because it likes to dry out really quickly and it's really messy. But if you like the sight of it, don't worry, because this is not going to be the last time we have to use this clay for this project, because I'm going to keep using foam core board. Once that's dry, I'm going to go back in with a crafting blade and a Dremel to really harden up these edges. I'm also going to sandpaper off the excess clay on the wood to reveal the planks underneath. This is the first step to hiding the planks underneath, but don't worry, we'll cover them up more later on. If you're following along at home, get your COVID masks out because this is stone dust and we don't want to breathe this in at all. But what this does give us is a bunch of stone dust, which we can scoop up and save for later, so put this dust in your memory pocket. But now we get to move on to the holy clay. Super Sculpey Unliving Doll, and Super Sculpey Medium, which is the gray one you will see a bit later, spoilers, is my favorite material to work with. So to make this Mimic, I'm gonna flatten out a bunch of sheets of clay so that we can, hold on, let's just, why would they design this pasta maker? Just make the handle shorter, it's just so, hold on, I gotta put it, I'm gonna flatten out a bunch of sheets of clay. It made a heart. I've made this Mimic out of aluminium foil and someone forgot to film it, but don't worry, they're fired. Let's cover up our shame with these sheets of clay. All it is aluminium foil squished into a vague Mimic shape with an aluminium wire inside of the tongue, just to keep its shape and make it bend easily. Once that's all covered up, I'm fitting it to the lip of the chest, and I'm adding extra bits of clay where needed to fill out and fit the Mimic base into the rim of the top of the chest. This doesn't have to be super duper perfect yet. This is mainly just to add enough material to make it fit nicely into the box that I've made. I'm also planning on eventually filling out any gaps with more air-dried clay so that I can perfectly fit everything together. The body of the mimic kind of retains a rectangular shape that fits with the lip of the lid and the chest itself, so I'm adding these little clay Toblerones to the edges and trying to make it feel like it's bending and twisting a little bit to make the mimic feel more floppy. Fun side note, this super sculpty clay is also what I'm made of, as you can tell by the matching skin tone. Enough yammering, put a lid on it. The mimic, that is. I was thinking we could use half a toilet paper roll and add some foam core board to the sides to keep its shape and structural integrity. This was a bad choice. This was a big mistake that's gonna cause a lot of problems going forward. Don't do this if you're following along at home. It looks good now, but this was bad news. Look, it fits. It looks great. Perfect. We're almost done. Of course, the lid has to also get wonked, so let's cut little notches into it and bend it into a more wonky shape. I also glued in an aluminium wire spine to keep the shape, and covered it with some toilet paper to really soak up that glue and fix it into place. Sort of a papier-mâché vibe. To make the body of the mimic connect to this lid, I had to do some minor brain surgery. I removed the top layer of clay so that I could fill it out with more aluminium foil. That way I can square it off against the lid a bit more and then put the clay back on. The mimic's body connects pretty snugly with the lid as well, so we need to add more clay between this edge and this body. And I'm not going to worry too much about a perfect fit, because when you put the Super Sculpey in the oven to harden, it does tend to sag a little bit, so it won't be a perfect fit after all of that is done anyway. Because I cleverly used foam core board as the end caps for the lid, I can't use Super Sculpey directly on top of it and put it in the oven, so I'm gonna have to cover it in aluminium foil and make another lid out of air-dry clay so that I have a rigid base for later. This is why we plan ahead. Anyway, while that's hardening, I'm going in with some more Sculpey and adding the fun little details. I'm adding creases and crevices. I'm going in with more Sculpey along the bottom to fit it into the chest a bit better. And then I'm using some sculpting tools to depress divots and dimples into the torso of the mimic to make it all look more melty and fleshy. And don't tell them I said this, but straight up just nasty. We're also gonna need a bunch of teeth. Let me see if I have any to spare. There you go. That should be enough. I pre-baked some bananas and balls out of white Fimo clay. These whole balls I'm gonna bisect into half balls, which will be our eyeballs. And with a swift nasty motion, we can tripophobe our way into Eyeball City. So I'll squeeze the eyeballs into place, and then I'll add some tiny bananas on the top and bottom to create sort of an eyelid. Not all of the eyeballs will get their own bespoke eyelids, though. Some of the balls will just be squeezed into little holes. I did nudge the surrounding clay into a vague almondy shape, though, so that the eye has a little bit of direction to it. Once all of the balls were in place, I went around the rest of the mimic and added some skin textures, some creases and folds. I wanted the tongue to feel very fleshy, so I added some extra deep folds and creases on the inner curve of the tongue. Now, don't tell the rest of the class, but I'm busting out the gums. I added some extra clay on the lower lip, and then I burrowed out some of these holes for the previously graciously donated teeth. To make sure the teeth stay in place for a long time, don't forget to floss or use Super Sculpey clay adhesive. This is sort of a liquid clay that binds and hardens in the oven. Once this dental drama is done, let's bust out the isopropyl alcohol to numb our feelings, and also, it's a good way to get rid of crumbs and tool marks or fingerprints on top of the clay. What the isopropyl alcohol will do is melt the very surface of the clay and sort of blend things together a bit better. If you don't have isopropyl alcohol, nail polish remover works just as well. But with that done, we'll mount it on a little thingy and put it in the oven at 150 degrees Celsius for 15 minutes. Okay, back to the lid. The clay has hardened, so I now have this thin lid-shaped shell that I can add clay to and stick in the oven. So with some more Super Sculpey, some of those bisected balls from before, another stint with a pasta maker, and some non-stick oven paper, let's flatten out and cut up some boards. The reason I want to make this lid out of clay fully is because it's such a wonky shape, using actual wood would just be uncomfortably awkward. So we'll hot dog the lid with a bit more of that oven bake adhesive and add a thin sheet of Super Sculpey on top just to make things stick a bit better. As I'm laying down these boards, I'm trying to make them conform to the shape of the lid and keep even spacing, and then I can go in with a silicone-tipped sculpting tool and sort of splay out the boards where I want there to be an eyeball. I'm also making sure to bevel the edges of the boards a bit so that they have a bit of a rounder feel to them. And for some of the eyeballs, I also chose to just cut out a bit of the board so that the eyeball was more visible. As I'm lining these boards up, I'm intentionally leaving a couple of gaps here and there because you can kind of see some fleshy bits of goodness poking through the boards in the game. Once that's all done, I'm coming back with a pokey tool and drawing in some grain into the wood. I'm also trying to shape it around where the eyeballs open up. And finally, for making clay wood, after having applied isopropyl alcohol, I'm brushing with a very coarse bristle brush to give that fine-grained wooden texture to the surface. Once everything is baked and hardened, it's time to dip back into our favorite clay and make the lid and the body line up a bit better. So I'm bridging the gap with some air-dry clay, and then as it starts to dry out, I can go back in with my sculpting tools and sort of match the surface texture and add some divots and bits and bumps here and there to blend it all together with the rest of the body. Luckily, the lid is now oven safe, so I'm gonna use Super Sculpey Medium, hat films for company, some coffee, all of these things are crucial, and some more pastification to add rims of metal to the lid. So I'll line all of the corners and edges of the lid with this clay, flatten it out a bit to sharpen up the edges, and then tatter it a bit because the Mimic is frayed and splayed and broken. And a final neat little touch is to bump up the clay with a ball-tipped tool to make it look like it's been hammered out and forged in the cold depths of hell? This strategy works pretty well for a quite satisfying rim job, but the lid also has these horns or sticky outy pokey bits that I can't really add with soft clay. Super Sculpey is great, but it doesn't hold its own weight very well in the oven, so I've made some crooked little bendy bits earlier that I've hardened separately, and I'll stick them onto the rims with some more of that oven bake adhesive. That way, they will keep their shape in the oven when I bake the rest of the lid. I didn't want the rim of the actual chest body to be thicker than they were, so I went in with my Dremel and just carved out the space in between the metal lining. That way, I wouldn't have to add as much material to the top. Who's a good clay? You're a good clay. This bad clay will be the bottom of the chest, so I line up the body with this little slab and cut off any excess. Then I can flip it all upside down and, in a very satisfying manner, pinch it off. Why are we still here just to suffer? Well, sometimes that's how crafting goes. The rim of the chest has these nice little decorative arches along the entire upper rim. So I got my thinnest aluminium wire and I bent little bits of it with a pair of tweezers and a ball-tipped tool. Then I could glue them incorrectly into that little gap that I've made with the Dremel on the short side of the chest, even though they're only supposed to be on the long side. For the rest of the various filigree, I elected to use thin slices of foam core board. Because it's kind of pliable and bendy, I could squish it into the shapes that I wanted, giving it, too, a hammered metal feel. Okay, remember that dust from before, though? Let's mix some water and some glue. Hang on, that's too much.
Waste not.
Let's mix some water and some glue with some of that dust. I had this idea that maybe this will make some sort of concrete-like substance that we could use to seal the entire model and maybe give it a bit more of a homogeneous surface. So I mixed all of that together until I was satisfied with the goopiness of the paste, and then just slathered that everywhere. I wanted to give the foam core board a smoother surface that is less foam looking, as well as giving the metal wire a bit more of a rough surface for the paint to adhere to. This also doubles as a sealant for the entire model, essentially coating everything in a thin layer of glue, making sure that everything is bonded together very well. And that's about it. The chest is done, the mimic body is done, the mimic itself is hardened, and everything fits together. Now let's base coat them in black. Nice, but don't glue them together just yet, because it'll be easier to paint them apart. Painting the mimic is fairly straightforward, it's just a lot of layers, so I'm starting with a deep purple for that blood flesh kind of vibe. I also made these little feet out of squished down snakes of clay that I will coat with the same paint. Acrylic paints are really hard to fade and blend, so what I find easier is starting with the darker shades and then adding lighter layers on top. But I prefer going in with an old makeup sponge because it removes any brush strokes and it adds a thinner layer of paint that I can then build up as I go. Once the body has dried, I'm going in with a very pink and adding more of a rosiness to those cheeks, as well as dabbing away a lot of it with a paper towel. I want this to be splotchy and feel as though it has blood vessels underneath, just to give it as much of an organic feel as I can, since clay and paint don't really have that subsurface scattering, the translucency of skin. I'm also giving all of the wood a watered down wash. This is just very dark brown with a lot of water and a drop of dish soap to break the surface tension. That makes the paint flow into any cracks and crevices. Think of it as an ambient occlusion pass. I'm continuing my layers of lighter and lighter colors, and you can see how well it works, where the sponge cannot reach all of those nooks and crannies, so it just adds another layer of color on top. So I'm doing a couple of layers of this, both for the chest and for the mimic, going progressively lighter and lighter and adding it more and more sparingly, just to create some variety. Now I just want a very small amount of reds. Help! A very small amount of red to some white for a very, very, very light pink. Almost like a halfway to dry brush pass. Dry brush? What's that? It's when you apply a very thin layer of paint to just the raised edges, usually done with a dry brush. Oh, I also snuck in some of that pink paint in between the boards of the lid. Shh, don't tell nobody though. Dry brushing is, well, you know this. I don't need to go over it again. You're down with the lingo now. You're part of the club. Come on, get your dry brushes out. Usually this is the step where all of the details start to really pop. I prefer to go in with a wash before the dry brush add the dry brush, and then do another dark wash to sort of bind all of it together. And here you can see how little the underlying boards actually showed through at the end of the painting process. But they're there! We know this! After all of the wood is done, I'm going in with a metallic paint for all of the metal rim. I know, a little bit predictable using metal for the metal. However, it is supposed to be fairly dark, so I will go over all of this with a wash later on to bring down the silveriness. For the metal filigree on the body, because it was raised, I could basically dry brush all of it without touching the wood underneath, and thereby getting fairly clean edges for the most part, which is good news for us. Same procedure as always for the teeth. I did 2 passes, but left them a little bit splotchy, because the mimic doesn't have perfect dental hygiene. Think about it. Where would it even keep a toothbrush? Its body takes up its entire chest. There's no room. Same color for the eyeballs though, with a pure black dot in the middle, and a very watered down red for sort of a eyeball fluid? I wanted the eyes to have a red tint to them. Maybe this mimic is sad, or maybe this mimic is a stoner. A final detail for the chest, a clay ring on either side and a little clay lock on the very front of the unopened chest. Okay, it's time to get messy again, but this time the mess is actually poisonous. You wear this. I wanted to coat the entire mimic body in resin. This is a 2-part epoxy resin, so you mix A and B in equal amounts, and then I also added a bit of ink to dye it a slight bloody color. Once mixed, this resin takes a day to cure, so let's sacrifice a brush to the resin gods and start slathering it on. I'm just gonna coat the entire mimic all over the place. This resin hardens as it looks, so it'll be perpetually moist and shiny forever. It also acts in a similar manner to a varnish on a painting, where it makes the underlaying colors more vivid and just really nice looking. And with that, I'm gonna leave this overnight, then I'll put all of the bits together, and I think it's time for the beauty shots. I hope you enjoy. we go! She's done! I'm actually pretty pleased with it. I was worried when I messed up so many stages with the foam core boards, but hey, perseverance, eh? I hope you enjoyed this little Halloween-y type video. Special thanks to all of the Patreons on Patreon. Next video will not be a crafting video, but I'll see you around, eh? Happy Halloween.